Okay, so what we saw was that the way they define the second law of thermodynamics in science is they talk about entropy, a thing called entropy. Entropy is a measure of disorder. Disorder being whatever it might be, that things are orderly and then now they become disordered. They were a nice new piece of metal, it's becoming rusty. Dust in the room, loss of information, like we talked about the telephone game, when you pass information around the circle, whatever, that's called entropy. Things are going downhill. Michelle occasionally goes over and does some cleaning for Peter, and he stays up all night before she comes over. Guess what he's doing? Cleaning. But he doesn't call it that. He says it's called entropy reduction. He's reducing entropy before she comes over to clean. And but entropy is constantly increasing. That means it's going downhill more and more. Now, the theory of evolution, as we saw last week through a number of quotes, is exactly the opposite. The theory of evolution is a directional change upward and improvements. After all, we have all evolved, according to them, from, as they say, molecules to man. From one-celled organisms, forget where life came from in the first place, even for a one-celled organism, up to complex organisms. And the human being and the human mind is the most complex of all. But where did it all come from? It's the opposite of the overall constant pressure and trend of the second law of thermodynamics, is everything is going downhill. Everything is not improving, everything's getting worse in time. And so how can evolution be true? And the evolutionists recognize the problem. Now, not all do. As we said last week, we had a guy here the very first week of this series who is an evolutionist who denies that the second law of thermodynamics is a problem for evolutionists. He just laughed and mocked at the mention of it.
You've got to let the science world know that, because it's no longer a law.
Yeah, right. That's right.
Always true.
But anyway, I mentioned last week that we'd be reading some fun quotes from a guy named Isaac Asimov. I used to read Isaac Asimov when I was a kid. I loved science fiction. I admit to still having a weakness toward liking it. But I tend to steer away from it more and more because it's really not of God largely. But Isaac Asimov himself is definitely a man who was not of God, though he now knows better. He has gone on to his reward. But he wrote over 100 science books, not science fiction, science books. But I used to read his science fiction books. He was a science fiction writer too. He was a biochemist. He was well known and well qualified to comment on this subject. And he wrote an article called "In the Game of Energy and Thermodynamics, You Can't Even Break Even." Do you get that title? In the Game of Energy and Thermodynamics, You Can't Even Break Even. He was an amusing writer, by the way. He had a way of writing that was fun to read. And there's a common cliche among engineers that goes like this. The first law says you can't win. In other words, you can't create it, you can't destroy it, you can't win. Okay. Second law, you can't even break even. Okay. Okay, Asimov defines the first law of thermodynamics, the law of conservation of energy, the following way. He says this: this law, the first law of thermodynamics, is considered the most powerful and most fundamental generalization about the universe that scientists have ever been able to make. No one knows why energy is conserved. All anyone can say is that in over a century and a quarter of careful measurements, scientists have never been able to point to a definite violation of energy conservation. In other words, this thing really is a law. I mean, if you find a single violation of a thing that's been decreed a law, it's no longer a law. It's disqualified. It's thrown out.
How do they measure that? They measure off the light. They measure off the heat.
I don't know how they do it, but
Adds up to a log.
it all adds up to a log, I guess. I don't know how they do it, Kelly, but they've never found any indication that you can create energy or that you can actually destroy it. Only you can change its forms, and I don't know how that is. Peter, maybe you have a great answer for that. He doesn't even know, and he's an engineer. Okay. Every process is an energy conversion process, but all energy is conserved. Okay. Now, what this tells us is that since energy is everything, and everything is a form of energy, All matter is a form of energy. It's just various forms, okay? Energy isn't just heat, or force. It's everything is a form of energy, okay? Everything in the physical universe is a form of energy, and energy is not now being created, and all processes have to obey this law. Even Asimov acknowledges that. Therefore, the study of these present processes that are going on can never tell us anything about where that energy came from in the first place. By definition. You got that? Okay. Energy is not now being created, according to the first law of thermodynamics, and everybody, including the evolutionists, have accepted that. Okay? There is no more creation. There is a change, there's conversion of energy going on. That process is going on, but there is no more creation. Therefore, what's going on tells us nothing about creation. Okay? What's going on in the conversion of energy from one form to another tells us nothing about the creation of energy. Tells us nothing about, therefore, the beginning. The fact that you observe the process that's going on now has nothing to do with where it came from in the first place or how it got there. Because the processes that are now presently going on cannot and do not create anything. They obey the first law of thermodynamics. Nothing is presently being created. Okay? Now, if we want information, therefore, about creation, we have to go someplace else besides science to get it. And again, we cheat. We got the book. We got the cheat book. The guy who did it all and who was there, he told us what happened. But this that we're talking about is even apart from God, okay, and believing in a personal God who is the creator. We have the fact that science cannot tell us anything about creation because creation by their own definition is not going on any longer. All right. Now, the second law of thermodynamics, entropy, which is constantly increasing, disorder increasing. I have a quote now from Harold Blum, who is a biochemist at Princeton. He wrote a book called Time's Arrow in Evolution. Time's arrow is the second law of thermodynamics, and this is the direction it's going, down. Okay? And the idea of the title is that as time goes on, energy keeps on going down, and his book is designed to try to harmonize the second law of thermodynamics with evolution. And here's his quote. He said, "The second law of thermodynamics has as one of its consequences that all real processes go irreversibly. Any given process in this universe is accompanied by a change in magnitude of a quantity called the entropy." In other words, as a process goes on, entropy is the byproduct of it, and it goes up, which is disorder. All real processes go with an increase in entropy. The entropy also measures the randomness or the lack of orderliness of the system. The greater the randomness, the greater the entropy. Unquote. Now again, we compare that with what Huxley said. He said that evolution affects all, evolution is everything. It's all-encompassing of everything in life, and it's all real processes, and it's an irreversible change, just like this. So in that sense, everything's the same except for one thing. What did he say? Irreversibly going up. Irreversibly increasing order. Okay? According to evolution, all real processes go to higher levels of organization and complexity, but according to the second law of thermodynamics, all real processes go with a decrease of order, orderliness, and greater randomness. So the two things, evolution and the second law of thermodynamics, are in fact, seem to be the opposite of each other. Each are universal laws, okay? Each are irreversible processes of change, but one changes up and the other changes down. Now, if they were totally different subjects, and they weren't both universal laws, they could be, one could be dealing over here, another over here, and they wouldn't conflict with one another. But the universal laws describing irreversible processes of change in opposite directions. Both can't be true. Henry Morris's comment to that is, do words mean anything? So what do evolutionists say about this apparent contradiction? Not many, in fact, deal with it. And I have to confess that Dan, our evolutionist friend who was here the first night, his way of dealing with it was unique in my experience, to laugh at it and say there's no problem. Most of them try to avoid it, don't talk about it unless they absolutely have to, and then they squirm. It's a problem, but apparently he's got an answer he should let the world know about. But Isaac Asimov, he did try to deal with it. In the same article that we quoted from a moment ago, again, which was in the game of energy and thermodynamics, you can't even break even, he said this: another way of defining the second law of thermodynamics, then, is that the universe is constantly getting more disorderly. Viewed that way, we can see that the second law all about us. We have to work hard to straighten the room, but left to itself, it becomes a mess again very quickly, very easily. Even if we never enter it, it becomes dusty and musty. How difficult to maintain houses and machinery and our own bodies in perfect working order. How easy to let them deteriorate. In fact, all we have to do is do nothing, and everything deteriorates, collapses, breaks down, wears out, all by itself. Now, he goes on to face the problem, and at this point he addresses his evolutionist friends, and he has an imaginary discussion with them. And he says this: now you evolutionists may argue that, and he is a dyed-in-the-wool evolutionist, you evolutionists may argue that the phenomenon of life may be an exception to the second law. Now, life in general, the fact that life has evolved. You'd say, evolution, then, and life is an exception to the second law. He says, life on Earth has steadily grown more complex, more versatile, more elaborate, more orderly. Now that, of course, when he states that, is an assumption, isn't it? That's an assumption of evolution. Over all the billions of years of the planet's existence, the existence of the Earth, 4.5 to 5 billion years, though I think that's going to be, if it hasn't already aged, it'll be aging a lot more soon. He says, from no life at all, living molecules were developed, and then living cells, and then living conglomerates of cells, worms, vertebrates, mammals, and finally man. And in man is a 3-pound brain, which is, as far as we know, is the most complex and orderly arrangement of matter in the universe. How could the human brain have ever developed out of the primeval slime, he asks. And how could this vast increase in order and therefore that vast decrease in entropy have ever taken place? See, the vast increase in order requires, it is by definition, a decrease of entropy. And yet, remember, second law of thermodynamics, everything, every process has attached to it an increase of entropy. He says the answer is it could not have taken place. The evolution of life could not have taken place without a tremendous source of energy constantly bathing the earth. For it's on that energy that life subsists. Remove the sun, S-U-N, and the human brain wouldn't have developed, nor the primeval slime either. Even the primeval slime wouldn't have developed if it wasn't for the sun. So what's the answer? The answer to the whole issue of the conflict between the second law of thermodynamics and evolution is the sun, the energy of the sun. He goes on to say, in the billions of years that it took for the human brain, got that? The billions of years it took for the human brain to develop, the increase in entropy that took place in the sun, as the sun is burning and entropy in it is increasing, the increase in entropy that took place in the sun is far greater, far greater than the decrease that is represented by the evolution required to develop the human brain. So in other words, what he is actually saying is very similar to what Dan was saying. Dan, the evolutionist, said that night, there's pockets of neg entropy. Pockets where entropy isn't going on, you have a decrease of entropy. And the Earth is one of those pockets. Because of this tremendous, vast energy of the sun, most of which isn't even doing anything for us, is going off in all directions. Okay, just a minute now. Yeah, if we got more sun, it wouldn't be damp, and then it wouldn't rust. Okay, but anyway, so we have the sun. The sun is such a tremendous source of energy. And as it's decreasing, as it's increasing in its entropy, giving off all this energy in the conversion process, that vast amount of energy is overcoming the natural tendency of the second law of thermodynamics for entropy to increase where we are too, except that vast energy is now overcoming that so that we are having the reverse. We're having an increase of order instead of an increase in disorder. Now, does that make a lot of sense to you, Mike? Not yet. Okay. In other words, the sun, being a tremendous source of energy, can maintain evolution on the scale of the Earth. After all, we're just Pezzywinkle compared to the sun, right? You can fit in the ball of the sun, we can fit 1 million Earths. That's how big the sun is compared to us. So we're just a mere nothing, right? So it can maintain evolution on the scale of the Earth over a period of geologic time, 5 billion years, even though eventually the sun will burn out and the universe will go down and the stars will die and the energy will be degraded down to lower and lower levels and finally to uniform heat throughout space and the universe, therefore may ultimately die what they call a heat death, where the heat just all, instead of having major heat sources, it ends up just all being an even temperature throughout the whole universe. Many billions of years yet in the future. But for a time, 5 billion years, 2 billion years of biological life on Earth, etc., on the scale of the Earth, the sun's energy is enough to maintain the evolutionary process, according to men like Asimov. But that still doesn't answer the question of where the sun come from. How did it get its original energy and order in the first place? No, I'm raising that question.
It almost sounds like the way he set up his explaining why we're so sophisticated today is, it would seem like towards the end you would have the highest order, but then all the energy would be gone, and then it would all die. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Because increase of entropy means an increase in orderliness.
A decrease in entropy is an increase.
The sun is
An increase of entropy in the major source results, But eventually, as that burns out, then it would all end up in collapse, right? Well, listen to what he says here. Now, I raised the question. It still doesn't answer the question, where did the sun come from? How did it get its original order and energy? So he goes on bravely to answer that obvious question by saying this, quote, "But where did it all start? If the universe is running down into utter disorder, what made it orderly to begin with? Where did the order come from that it's steadily losing? What set up the extremes that are steadily being chipped away?" You understand that if you don't have differences in energies, you can't have work. You know, if you put water up on a hill and let it run through the pipes, you get water pressure. Or you put it up high in a tank and let it run out of the tank, it can turn a turbine as it pours out of the tank, and it can generate electricity. There's work because of levels of energy. And heat, being allowed to burn and run down, can give you light energy and heat energy. When I say heat, a fire. Burning a fire, you can have heat and light, all these things. If you don't have any of that, if there's no changes going on, there's no work, everything's dead. So he says, what set up the extremes that are steadily being chipped away? Now, up to this point, the things he's said are largely coming from a scientific point of view, even though he may be wrong, and is wrong, especially when he concludes the sun is the answer to it all. But he's been somewhat scientific up to this point, but now he becomes utterly and completely a philosopher and a metaphysical speculator when he says the following. Scientists, this is a direct quote now, the scientists are still arguing this point. Some think that the universe originally had its matter and energy all smashed together into one huge cosmic egg. A situation something like a tremendous deck of cards, all arranged in order. The cosmic egg exploded. And ever since, for billions of years, the universe has been running down. The deck of cards is being shuffled and shuffled and shuffled. Others think that there is some process in the universe that spontaneously decreases entropy. Okay, and I got that? Let me read that again. Some think there's some process, they don't know what it is, in the universe that spontaneously decreases entropy. That is, makes things get better, get good. Some natural process that unshuffles and reorders the cards. We don't know what that can be. Perhaps because it takes place under conditions we cannot observe and cannot duplicate in the laboratory. In other words, we're not talking science now. Say in the center of an exploding galaxy, perhaps. In that case, as some parts of the universe run down, others build up. Now, what he just described there in fancy terms, non-sophisticated, non-scientific, but fancy terms as far as flowery language, he described the Big Bang and steady-state theories of the universe. Then again, he says it may be that once the universe runs down, the random collision of particles may, after some unimaginable span of years, just happen to bring about an at least partial unshuffling. After all, if you shuffle and reshuffle ceaselessly for trillions of years, you may violate the second law and end up with an arrangement possessing at least some order just by the laws of chance. Yeah, the cards will wear out, yeah. And by the way, you'll notice, even with the cosmic egg and all that stuff, still no explanation of any kind of where it all came from in the first place. Whether it was orderly or disorderly, at any phase, where did it come from in the first place? Never an answer with that. Which, by the way, bottom line, they have to hold that the universe is infinitely old. Otherwise, it had a beginning. If it had a beginning, how was it? Yeah. Okay, it says, and once that happens, that is, by the laws of chance, some orderly arrangement happened, the universe begins to run down again at once. Perhaps then we live in a universe that was partially restored to order after a quadrillion years of having been run down. You see, we've gone from millions to billions to trillions, now to quadrillions. Remember, I've made the statement to you that no matter how much time they give you, it's never enough time. And he's proven the point here. Does anybody know how long a quadrillion year is? A quadrillion of years is? I mean, it's mind-boggling. You can't even imagine it. Yeah. Okay. It's less than a which? A gazillion. Okay, yeah. Okay. All right, let me read that line again. It's so good. I hate to waste a good line with one mere reading. Let's read it again. Perhaps then we live in a universe that was partially restored to order after a quadrillion years of having been run down. And I typed the word been with extra e's in it. After having been run down, okay? We're now running down again. Just happens to be that's the phase we're in right now, you see. Again, after the universe is completely run down, another quadrillion years or so may see a section of it unshuffle once more. Now, remember, unshuffling is reordering. Okay?
In other words, all this mass of just universal heat just all of a sudden comes together into stars.
Apparently, yeah. Stars and galaxies will form then again, and life may be established here and there, and undoubtedly some science writer will sit down, this is in a quadrillion years or so, and begin to wonder again where it all came from and where it will all end. Unquote.
But we already knew. We could have told them.
Undoubtedly.
Undoubtedly.
I can't believe that. This is a famous writer.
Yeah, well,
I
absolutely.
had friends in grade school, and he and I used to sit around and say silly stuff just like that.
Now, I want to give you a direct quote now from Henry Morris in his response to Isaac Asimov's comments. He says, quote, well, maybe, perhaps, who knows, could be, possibly, Then he says, now it's a free country and a person can believe that if he wants, but he shouldn't call it science. That's obviously not science. Science is knowledge, what we can see and measure and observe. That's not science. Now,
if that's not enough, just in case.
okay, now to illustrate the first and second laws of thermodynamics with a graph, and I hope you can all see this. It's just a thing I just scratched on a piece of paper. Okay, this is a graph now. We have energy over here. Down here be 0, and this is higher and higher amounts of energy on the left-hand side of the graph, on the vertical. On the horizontal, we have time, as time goes on here, all right? Now, the first law of thermodynamics would be graphed by a straight line across in time with a fixed amount of energy just going straight across with no change. That's the first law of thermodynamics. No more, no less. Second law of thermodynamics is graphed by starting at the beginning where you had total energy and total usage of the energy, and as time goes on, it drops down, 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 and eventually fizzles out to nothing.
Usable energy.
Usable energy. Excuse me. Usable energy. Thank you for keeping me honest on that point. So the significance is that eventually available energy is going to go down to 0, and all energy of the universe will be uniformly dispersed through space in complete disorder, completely random. Randomness, by the way, to understand that term, is the opposite of specific form, specific complex forms and usage, etc. It's just randomly dispersed. It's like taking all the money, quote unquote, and spreading it out among everybody. Everybody has an equal share. By the way, that would be a very dull world. Not only for those who have little, but if everybody has the same, everybody has little. By the way, when some have a lot, it at least creates a desire to aspire to more and aspire to better things, which gives life some interest, even for unbelievers.
Energy from higher to lower, you get a transfer of money from higher to
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so we have everything eventually going down to uniformal dispersion through all space in complete disorder, complete randomness. It would still be there in some form of a low temperature, but there would be no more work that could be done because there's no more difference of energy levels anywhere, ultimately, according to the long enough period of time going past, that's what would happen to everything. The sun is burning out. I mean, the sun is burning up. What is it, 5 feet an hour or something of the sun is reducing in size in its radius, like 5 feet every hour. So, and they say that there's a point at which, hypothetically, we don't know this for sure, obviously, but it appears that there's a point at which the sun would just kind of collapse in on itself and just kind of all go out. It's not like it would keep on burning down to a little spark. And so as it gets down to a certain point, it would just kind of collapse and the fire would go out. Well, that might be too, but that I think is speculation also. But regardless, the sun and what it's doing is not going to go on like this forever if time were to go on forever. Okay, and they even talk about, well, in so many millions of years the sun's going to burn out, and that's going to be the end. You know, at least of this present orderliness.
Going for 5 billion years,
yeah.
It would have been engulfed the Earth.
Well, that's the thing. As long as you're mentioning that now, I was going to talk about that at a later time, but that's an excellent point. If the sun is burning up at 5 feet an hour, even if it's 5 feet a day, it all still figures out to terrible consequences. If it's been here for 5 billion years, the sun would have been so big back then that we would be burned, we would be engulfed in it. We wouldn't exist. Even if it wouldn't reach us, it would be still so close to us, we'd just be turned into a cinder. So the idea of it being here for even 5 billion years, let alone being here forever, it cannot be. Okay, so the result of all of this then is eventually, given enough time, if there is no God and he has no plans for the future, the universe is going to die, and our part of the universe is certainly going to die, and though it would still be in existence, it would just be in nothingness for all practical purposes. The death of the universe hasn't happened yet. Does everybody recognize that? The universe is still here and it's still alive, still going on. Okay. All right. Tonight's meeting is evidence. Very good. Consequently, the universe is not infinitely old. If the universe is infinitely old, it would have already burned out. Therefore, if it's not infinitely old, and it must not be infinitely old, then it must have had a beginning. Now, that is simply a logical fact. It is either infinitely old or it had a beginning. Can't be both. But all observations compel us to the fact that it could not be infinitely old, or it would already be all burned out. Now, if it had no beginning, because it is not burned out, therefore it is not infinitely old, and the first law says that it could not have begun itself. Energy is neither being created nor destroyed. But it did have a beginning, could not have created itself. Therefore, the universe had to have begun by being created. Now, we've just deduced that by observation of the scientific facts. Scientifically, the most obvious and most scientific conclusion that you can draw is that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, you can say, if a non-Christian and person who doesn't believe in God could say, drop the word God out of it, say, in the beginning, something created the heavens and the earth. Okay, that is a scientific conclusion. Which, again, I don't care if it's scientific or not, because the Bible says so. That's what I go by. But it also happens to be a scientific observation. The most scientific statement anybody can possibly make based on what we know about present processes in nature is that God created in the beginning. Now, it's not proof positive, but it's the only logical conclusion from everything that we do know that can be actually drawn from the observations and facts. But based on the present laws of thermodynamics and everything else, and extrapolating backwards, you reach a point of discontinuity. Even within this in the laws, you have this point of creation on the chart. So that's the point at which everything came into existence, and all of the energy was available and all was usable until some point after that. Now, for us, what point was that we happen to know, because we have the cheat book? The fall. The fall of man brought sin and death into the world. Now, as Asimov says, perhaps somewhere far back in time or way out in space somewhere where nobody can see it or know for sure what's going on, there's something to offset the second law. Now, again, maybe so, but you can see the chart of what we do know, and we can't see the maybe, and he admits we have no idea what it might be or where it is. None whatsoever.
We know it's not God.
So, yeah, we know it's not God, yeah. But anyway, one of saying, well, maybe, is philosophy, and the other is science. The first and second laws of thermodynamics are science. And the conclusion that you're forced to draw from it is, in fact, a scientifically based observation and conclusion. The other is philosophical. So if anything is in fact scientific, the creation model is scientific, in that it patterns itself after and is consistent with, that's backwards to say it patterns itself after, I don't mean to say it that way. Our model is consistent with the pattern of the first and second laws of thermodynamics entirely, 100%, where the evolution model completely must ignore it or postulate some faraway, distant, unknown thing that nobody's ever seen, heard of, and can't even imagine what it is that's undoing the second law of thermodynamics as fast as it's trying to tear everything down.
And that's a fact.
And that then is the fact. Okay, scientifically then, the most reasonable extrapolation and projection and conclusion that one can draw is in the beginning, God. Now, back to Asimov's contention that the sun, bathing the earth for 5 billion years in an open system, Okay, now, you know what an open and closed system is? An open system is when you're just pouring all kinds of energy into an isolated, there's an isolated system, isolated in that here's this little system. Now you just keep dumping energy into it, wherever you can get it, just dump it in there. So it's open in that that system has energy constantly coming into it. A closed system is where you look at a system that's all self-contained, nothing's coming in to help it, and you just watch it work on its own. Okay? So he's viewing the Earth as an open system because all this energy is coming into it. And he's saying that the evolutionary process is going on with the use of this energy in this open system, even though eventually the universe itself is going to die. But in the meantime, this wonderful little thing is taking place. Now, the laws of thermodynamics are defined in terms of a closed system because it's the only way they can be defined in terms of actual mathematics and science. But in actual nature, in real life, there's no such thing as a closed system in real life. Everything is basically an open system. And yet, all the tests really in effect take place on open systems, therefore, because it's the only kinds there are, the only kind of systems there are open systems. And yet, it still always works. Even with the open systems, all open systems eventually all increase in entropy and decay and die. There's no exceptions to the laws of thermodynamics anybody's ever come up with, even with the fact that it really is all an open system. So an open system added, you open up a system to added sources of energy, you can get temporary life or growth for a while, such as when you put gas in the car, it'll drive for a while, you know. Or, you know, you feed a child, it'll grow, right? I mean, you look at a little baby, and it ends up being an adult who can function and do all this stuff. Isn't that an exception? We're pouring energy in there and look at it's going, but what eventually happens? What eventually happens to the car? It runs out of gas, or it stops working no matter how much gas you put in it, and it ends up turning into a rust bucket, ends up in the junkyard, pressed into a cube. And if it's not pressed into a cube, it'll just sit there and rust and rust and rust until it turns to dust. So even though there are temporary isolated things that we can look at as apparent examples of exceptions, they really aren't exceptions. Again, the evolutionists point to things like crystals that grow, trees that grow out of seeds, animals that grow out of an embryo, the building of a car, the building of a building, you know, build a building. Look, that's the opposite of entropy, isn't it? Now, the problem is that the law of decay is still a universal law in terms of tendency, even in those systems where it appears that there's a temporary exception. Any system left to itself will decay. They require constant work to maintain them. Even the child, constant feeding. The car has to keep on being washed and waxed and gassed and repaired and all that. And eventually still what happens? Mark, what happens? He's back to working on my car again. After all these years, he thought he got out of that. Now he's back to working on my car again. And I keep getting cars that are already old.
Fighting the second law of thermodynamics all the time.
Right. But even more so when he's working with me in my car, it seems.
That's what I mean.
Okay. Any system left to itself will decay. To have growth even locally and temporarily, you have to open up the system an outside of source of energy, but also to an outside source of order and information. The evolutionists give the sun as their simplistic answer to say, hey, the Earth is an open system, it's open to the energy of the sun, and all this energy is enough to overcome the entropy and the second law of thermodynamics, and the evolutionary process producing these increases in order is the result of this vast energy being poured into our open system. But that's completely and entirely too simple, and it ignores the realities and the fact that simply dumping massive amounts of energy into a system does not bring or produce order or growth. There's enough energy, hypothetically, yes, there's enough energy from the sun to do this stuff, but by itself, It's not enough to produce growth. You take a building, for example, when you're building a building out of a pile of bricks. Why waste all the resources that we waste after we buy the bricks? Why not just let the sun beat on the bricks long enough for the bricks to order themselves into a building? I mean, that would be a more efficient way of using your resources, wouldn't it? According to the evolutionary theory, anything can happen if you wait long enough. We're going to be talking later on in the next few weeks about time. What? HUD uses that approach. I've got a quote where one of these evolutionists admits that time is the hero, he says, of the story. That's literally a quote. Time is the hero of the story. If you just given enough time, anything can happen. They state that over and over again, and most people go, well, yeah, given enough time, anything can happen. And for the sake of discussion here, we're not in a hurry. Okay, we won't press the issue. We'll just wait and let the sun cause with its energy, cause the pile of bricks to organize itself into a building. After all, it's an open system. It's open to the energy of the sun, and anything can happen given enough time, right? Right? Wrong. You see, the statement is wrong. Given enough time, anything can't happen. In fact, what will happen given enough time? The bricks turn to a pile of dust. They will never order themselves into a building. You can add the energy of the sun, you can add all kinds of wind and other energy sources and forms of energy that are random, and it will only produce decay and more randomness. In fact, what eventually happens to the pile of bricks before it turns into dust? The pile ends up falling apart. The bricks don't just stay there in a neat pile forever. Something ends up always happening there. Bricks are falling off down the side, and the piles start to tip, and they fall over, and then eventually it all turns to dust. Given enough time, anything can't happen. But given enough time, the one thing that's guaranteed to happen is entropy increasing. The idea that anything is probable given a certain probability simply isn't true. Now, we're going to talk also later about the vast odds against evolution. There's tremendous statistical odds against evolution. And I'm going to show you that they're so vast that even with a simple little illustration, the simplest possible illustration, the numbers are unimaginable. And if you actually tried to put it to the test of anything even a little more complex, it causes computers to shut down. Okay? But they, what they say? Well, but it's still, even though it's 1 out of a quadrillion zillion, it's all those big numbers, any name you can put to it, which is never enough, against 1 to it happening. There's still a chance.
And you know why? There's proof. There it is. It happened.
Yeah. They say, yeah. Well, look, it has happened. So obviously, it can happen given enough time. But again, the problem is that to say that something is going to probably happen, if there's a probability of it happening, a probability doesn't mean that it's going to happen. It's just a way of analyzing the improbability and the unlikeness of something happening. The fact that you can say, well, statistically, there's 1 chance in, a quadrillion for something to happen. By the way, that's a small number. But if there's in this stuff, it's a small number. But if there's 1 chance of a quadrillion, I'll guarantee you it's not going to happen. By the way, say if you roll enough dice, let's say you get, you're rolling a pair of dice, and you're saying, well, how many times can I throw double sixes in a row? What are the odds against that? Well, every time you say, well, if I roll to get 10 in a row, you got 2 dice, and each one has a chance of 1 out of 6. So to get 2 sixes together, it's 1 out of 6 times 1 out of 6 is 1 out of 36. Okay. Now, to throw double sixes again, it's 1 out of 36 times 1 out of 36. To do it 10 times in a row, it's 1 out of 36 to the 10th power. That's a huge number. Okay. Now the fraction's a small number, but the number underneath, the odds against it, are a large number. Okay. Well, I'm out of time, so I'm going to run a tape here before I finish this, but I want to finish the thought. So I'll get back to this next week before I, when we get to the beginning of the tape. But let me just finish this thought now so we don't end just hanging.